The morning sun filtered through the narrow servants' corridor of Thornveil Citadel, casting long shadows across worn stone floors that had been polished 1,000 times by hands far more delicate than they appeared. Liora Ashvane moved through these shadows like a ghost, her movements practiced and efficient, almost invisible in the way she navigated the spaces between the castle's grandeur and its hidden machinery. She carried a stack of linens that reached nearly to her chin, the pale fabric pristine against her simple gray servant's dress. Her auburn waves had been twisted into a tight braid that morning, pulled back so severely that not a single strand dared to escape, a style she'd learned to adopt years ago. It made her less noticeable, less likely to catch attention, less likely to become the target of scrutiny. The citadel was already stirring at this early hour. Liora had been awake since before dawn, as she always was. Sleep had never come easily to her, not since she was a girl, and she'd learned to use those quiet hours before the castle woke to complete the most tedious of her duties. The morning was her refuge, a time when the halls belonged to her alone, when she could exist in a pocket of solitude before the day's demands began in earnest. She paused at the alcove near the eastern wing, setting down her linens carefully on the marble shelf. Her fingers, long and graceful despite the calluses that marked them, trembled slightly as she reached up to adjust a painting that hung slightly crooked on the wall. It was a small thing, this correction, but Liora had been trained by years of meticulous service to notice such imperfections and address them without being asked. The emerald eyes that swept across the corridor held an intelligence that seemed almost too bright for a servant, though no one ever lingered long enough to truly see it. Gold flecks caught the morning light when she glanced upward, a peculiarity she'd learned to keep hidden beneath the veil of her otherwise unremarkable appearance. Those eyes had seen too much for her 23 years, witnessed too many things that should never have been witnessed by someone so young. Yet here she was, moving through her duties with the grace of someone far older and infinitely more weary. The north corridor was her responsibility this morning. 3 hours of changing linens, sweeping, and polishing surfaces that barely needed polishing, and keeping herself as small and unobtrusive as possible. This was the corridor where the council chambers lay, where the most powerful men in the kingdom conducted their business. Liora had learned long ago to be particularly invisible in this section of the castle. The council members were not unkind in the way that casual cruelty might manifest. They were not the type to strike without reason or speak harshly to a servant without provocation. Rather, they had cultivated a specific kind of indifference that was, in its own way, far more dangerous. All except one. Lord Aldrich Voss occupied the position of High Chancellor, and he had claimed the suite of rooms at the very end of the North Corridor as his own during his frequent visits to Thornveil Citadel. Liora had encountered him for the first time nearly 8 months ago, and she had spent every moment since learning to anticipate his movements, to time her duties so that they would not intersect with his presence in the halls. It was impossible to avoid him entirely, but she had become remarkably skilled at minimizing their interactions. The problem was that Lord Voss was equally skilled at seeking her out. He was a large man, though not in the way that Alpha King Cale Thornwood was large, where Cale's massive frame radiated power and control. where his presence filled a room with the weight of authority that was both earned and feared. Aldrich Voss possessed the bloated heaviness of privilege taken to excess. His face was florid, his jaw soft, his eyes a muddy brown that held no warmth whatsoever. He was perhaps 50 years old, though his dissipated appearance made him seem simultaneously both younger and far older than that. The first time he had truly noticed her, it had felt like the moment before a predator struck. 3 weeks ago, he had cornered her in the linen storage room near his chambers. Liora had been collecting soiled bedding, her arms full, her attention focused on the task at hand. The door had closed behind her with a soft click, and in that small space, she had felt the temperature drop at least 10 degrees. She had not turned around immediately. Instead, she had finished placing the linens in her basket, her movements controlled and deliberate, though her heart had begun to beat in irregular patterns that made her lightheaded. "You're the silver-haired one," Lord Voss had said, his voice carrying a tone of discovery. "The quiet girl they always assign to the north corridor." Liora had turned to face him then, keeping her gaze carefully lowered. "I apologize if I've disturbed you, my lord. I was simply collecting your linens." That was when he'd reached out and grasped her upper arm, his fingers digging into the soft fabric of her dress and the flesh beneath. The strength in his grip had surprised her. That was always the shock, discovering that despite his soft appearance, he possessed genuine strength. He'd pulled her closer, and she had caught the smell of wine on his breath and something else beneath it, something acrid and unpleasant that made her wolf stir uneasily beneath her skin. "Let me see your eyes," he had commanded, his fingers still biting into her arm. She had lifted her gaze to meet his, keeping her face carefully blank, her expression docile and empty of any defiance. The gold flecks in her emerald eyes had caught the light, and she had seen his expression change, saw a flush creep up his neck. "Interesting," he had murmured, his thumb beginning to rub against her arm in a way that made her skin crawl. "I wonder what other surprising qualities you might possess, little servant." "I'm simply here to attend to your rooms, my lord," she had replied quietly, pulling her arm away with what she hoped was an appropriate amount of deference rather than desperation. "Is there anything I can bring you? Fresh water? Tea?" He had let her go, but only because a knock had sounded at the door to his adjacent chambers. Someone had called out, requiring his attention. Liora had escaped that day, but the encounter had set the tone for the weeks that followed. Each time she had entered his suite to change linens or clean, he had found reasons to be present. He had begun to touch her in small ways, a hand on her shoulder, a brush against her side when she passed, fingers trailing down her arm, never so much as to leave obvious marks, always presented with a veneer of courtesy that made it impossible for her to object without seeming ungrateful or insubordinate. 2 weeks ago, he had demanded that she attend to his personal laundry, a task that usually fell to the senior maidservants. She had stood in his chambers while he directed her toward his soiled garments, and when she had bent to collect them, he had stepped closer, invading the small pocket of space she tried to maintain. He had asked her invasive questions about her life, her background, where she came from. She had deflected each inquiry with careful politeness, but she had felt his eyes on her, assessing her, finding something in her that he found both compelling and contemptible. Last week, he had made it clear, without words, that he expected her to visit his chambers earlier than her usual schedule, before the other servants were active in the halls. When she had arrived, he had been waiting in a state of dishevelment, his shirt partially unbuttoned. He had tried to draw her close, his hands reaching for her, and she had taken a step backward, her voice steady despite the panic beginning to claw at her throat. "I'm afraid I'm not available for that sort of service, my lord," she had said, using the exact tone of a servant declining a task she was genuinely unequipped to perform. "Perhaps you might prefer I call for one of the senior ladies of the household? They might be better suited to your needs." He had laughed at that, a sound like gravel being dragged across stone. "Oh, I think you underestimate yourself, Liora. I think you could be very well suited to my needs if only you were a bit more willing." He had stepped toward her, and she had stepped toward the door, maintaining that careful distance. "You can't avoid me forever, little silver-haired servant. Sooner or later, you're going to run out of hallways to hide in." The bruise on her upper arm, vivid purple against her pale skin, had appeared 3 days ago. Lord Voss had followed her into the storage room again, and when she had tried to leave, he had grabbed her arm with both hands, his fingers digging in with an intensity that crossed the line from discomfort into genuine pain. He had pulled her close, his breath hot against her face. "Tell me what you are," he had hissed, his eyes boring into hers. "You're not a normal servant. No normal servant has eyes like that. No normal servant moves the way you do." His grip had tightened. "Are you a shifter? Is that what you're hiding?" "You're hurting me, my lord," she had said quietly, and there had been something in her voice, some thread of genuine pain that had made him release her, though not before twisting her arm sharply enough to make her gasp. "Not yet," he had said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But I will. Eventually, you're going to learn that you can't refuse me. You're going to learn that no matter what you are, it doesn't give you the right to deny me anything I want." She had pulled herself away from him and walked back to the main corridor, her hands shaking so severely that she had nearly dropped the linen basket she was carrying. The bruise had bloomed over the next hours, spreading across her upper arm in shades of purple and sickly green. She had taken to wearing longer sleeves, positioning herself so that the damaged flesh was hidden from view. And she had said nothing to anyone, because what could she possibly say? Lord Voss was a member of the council, a man of position and authority. She was a servant whose lineage was unknown and whose background was shrouded in mystery. No one would believe her if she accused him of anything. Besides, she had survived worse things than this. The silver in her blood gave her resilience that allowed her to heal faster than normal humans, though the bruises still took their time fading. The physical pain was something she could manage. It was the feeling of helplessness, the growing sense of inevitability that truly frightened her. The morning her life changed, Liora was finishing her duties in the North Corridor. She had completed most of her work and was beginning to gather her supplies when she heard footsteps approaching, heavy, purposeful footsteps that made the stone floor seem to vibrate beneath her feet. She looked up from where she was adjusting a tapestry and felt her breath catch in her throat. Alpha King Kael Thornwood had returned to his castle. He was a vision of power incarnate, moving through the corridor with the loose grace of a predator, in his own territory. His massive frame seemed to make the hallway grow smaller, the ceilings lower, the air itself thicker and more difficult to breathe. Long black hair fell past his shoulders in waves that somehow managed to look both wild and carefully maintained. Steel gray eyes swept across the corridor with the intensity of someone conducting a thorough assessment of their domain. He was dressed in dark leather and black wool, clothes that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the corded muscles of his arms. The scent of him reached her before his body did, wild and sharp, like winter wind and dark forests, overlaid with something that was uniquely him, uniquely predatory and ancient and impossibly male. Leora's wolf, and dormant and carefully suppressed beneath layers of servile politeness, rose to attention with a force that nearly buckled her knees. Her hand shot out to steady herself against the wall, her fingers pressing into cold stone. Her heart, which had been beating at a steady, controlled pace, suddenly went wild with a rhythm that felt almost manic. "My lord," she managed, dropping into the low curtsy that was her trained response to the presence of Alpha King Cale Thornwood. Her emerald eyes stayed fixed on the floor, though she was acutely aware of his presence, of his attention turning toward her like a searchlight cutting through darkness. Cale's footsteps slowed. He stopped walking. The silence that followed was heavy and charged with a tension that Liora didn't fully understand, but could nonetheless feel in every nerve of her being. "Rise," he commanded, and his voice was exactly as she remembered it from the few times she had glimpsed him in the halls of the castle before his extended campaign in the Southern Territories. Deep and authoritative, tinged with an accent that spoke of blood and legacy and ancient power. It was a voice that could bend wills simply by asking them to bend. She rose from her curtsy, keeping her gaze carefully lowered, though it took every ounce of her willpower not to look up into his face. "What is your name?" he asked, and there was something in his tone that hadn't been there a moment before, a kind of intensity that suggested this was not an idle inquiry. "Liora Ashvane, my lord," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm a servant in the North Corridor. I was just finishing my duties." The silence that followed seemed to stretch out for an eternity. She could feel his eyes on her, assessing her, reading her in the way that the most powerful alphas could read people. Shifters had the ability to smell emotions, fear, desire, aggression, deception. She could feel his senses extending toward her, trying to parse out the sense that emanated from her body. She fought to keep her breathing steady, to project an aura of calm competence, even as her wolf strained against the bonds of control. "You're injured," he said finally, and it was not a question. Leora's hands clenched at her sides. How could he possibly know? The bruise was hidden beneath her sleeve. She had been careful to position herself so that nothing was visible. "Nothing serious, my lord," she responded, her voice steady despite the turmoil churning beneath her calm exterior. "Just a small accident during my duties. It's already healing." Something flickered across his face, a tightening of his jaw, a darkening of his already storm-gray eyes. He took a step closer, and Leora's wolf surged forward with a whimper of recognition that she barely managed to suppress. "What kind of accident?" His voice had dropped, becoming quieter, though no less commanding. "Simply clumsy on my part, my lord. Nothing to concern yourself with." "Look at me." It was not a request. It was an alpha command, woven through with threads of power that made it nearly impossible to refuse. Liora raised her eyes to meet his, and the moment she did, she understood why her wolf was behaving so strangely. It was in his eyes, in the way they locked with hers and seemed to recognize something in her that she had spent her entire life trying to hide. It was in the shift of his expression, the subtle tightening of his muscles, as though he had been struck by something unexpected and powerful. "Roll up your sleeve," he commanded quietly. "My lord, that's not necessary." "Roll up your sleeve." The power woven through those 3 words was undeniable. Liora found her hand rising almost of its own accord, reaching for the sleeve of her dress and pulling it upward to expose her upper arm. The bruise was spectacular in its severity, a canvas of purples and yellows and sickly greens that painted a clear picture of how hard she had been gripped. She saw his hand clench into a fist. She saw the muscles in his jaw work, and saw something primal and ancient begin to surface in his expression. But when he spoke, his voice was careful and controlled, each word measured with deliberate precision. "Who did this to you?" he asked. And there was something in that question that suggested that the answer to it would have significant consequences. "It was truly an accident, my lord. I was carrying linens, and I lost my grip, and my arm caught on the corner of a shelf. It's nothing serious. I heal very quickly as it is." The words came out smoothly, the lie practiced and polished through repetition. But she saw something shift in his expression, saw him realize that she was lying, and more importantly, saw him realize why. The understanding that bloomed in his eyes was terrible in its completeness. "Someone hurt you deliberately," he said, and this time there was no question in his voice either. "And you're protecting them." "No, my lord, I assure you, do not lie to me." His voice had become dangerously quiet, each word clipped and precise. "My wolf knows the scent of fear. My wolf knows the scent of deceit. And my wolf smells both of those things, rolling off you right now in waves. Someone in this castle has laid hands on you, and you are lying to protect them. I want to know who." Liora's eyes had begun to burn with tears that she absolutely could not afford to shed. She took a breath, trying to steady herself, trying to find the words that would deflect this line of questioning without confirming his suspicions. "With all due respect, my lord, I am fine. Whatever happened was an accident, and I have already forgotten about it." "There is no need to concern yourself." She saw something crack in him then, saw the absolute control he maintained fracture for just a moment before he reasserted dominance over himself. When he spoke again, his voice had become so quiet that she had to lean forward slightly to hear the words. "My wolf recognizes you," he said, and the words hung in the space between them like a confession, like a curse, like a revelation that would alter the course of both their lives. "My wolf knows what you are to me, and my wolf is telling me that if I do not find whoever hurt you within the next hour, I am going to lose control of myself in ways that I haven't experienced in decades. So I will ask you one more time, and I need you to answer me truthfully. Who hurt you?" The mate bond. It had always been spoken of in whispers among the servants, in a legend of ancient power that most of them didn't truly believe existed. It was supposed to be rare, a bond that formed between a shifter and their destined other half. It was supposed to be unconditional and immutable, and absolutely undeniable. Liora had heard stories, whispered conversations between the older women of the household about alphas who had recognized their mates and felt compelled to do anything necessary to protect them. But she had never truly believed those stories were real. Certainly, she had never imagined that such a thing could apply to her, a servant girl of unknown lineage, with a secret that could get her killed if discovered. And yet, here was Alpha King Cale Thornwood, the most powerful man in the entire kingdom, looking at her with eyes that promised absolute devastation to anyone who had caused her harm. Lord Aldrich Voss, she whispered, the name escaping her lips before she could stop herself. He is a council member. He has been bothering me for some weeks now, but it's nothing that I can't manage. He hasn't done anything that would warrant your involvement. She watched as Cale's expression became absolutely still, as though he had temporarily ceased all motion, all breathing, all conscious thought. When he finally moved, it was with the controlled grace of someone exercising the absolute maximum of their self-control. He turned away from her, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides, and she could see the tension running through his entire frame. Stay in the servants' quarters, he commanded, his voice still dangerously quiet. I want you where I can see you, where I can protect you. Do not leave those quarters for any reason except to attend to your regular duties in areas where other servants will be present. Do you understand me? Yes, my lord, she replied. And Liora? He turned back to her, and his eyes were burning with a fire that seemed to come from somewhere deep and primal and absolutely ancient. What he has done to you ends today. That's not a promise. That's not a threat. That is a simple statement of fact. After she turned to leave, moving mechanically back toward the servants' quarters, Kyle remained standing in the corridor for a long moment, his entire body trembling with the effort it took to maintain control. The rage that coiled through him was not the ordinary anger of a man defending his household. This was something deeper, more primal, more dangerous. This was the fury of his wolf, the ancient predator that shared his consciousness, recognizing that their mate had been hurt and demanding immediate, violent retribution against the one responsible. His hands remained clenched at his sides, the muscles in his forearms working as he forced himself not to shift right here in the castle corridor, not to allow his wolf to take physical form and hunt Aldrich Voss like prey across the stone floors of Thornveil Citadel. Every instinct screamed at him to find the man, to make him pay in ways that were brutal and absolute. The wolf wanted blood, wanted to taste it, wanted to hear Voss beg for mercy that would never come, wanted to ensure that no other male would ever question the consequences of touching what belonged to his king. But Kale had spent centuries learning to master that impulse, to channel the raw power of his wolf into something more refined, more devastating, more permanent. He walked through the castle with deliberate slowness, his breathing controlled, and even despite the tempest raging beneath his skin, every servant he passed seemed to sense the danger that emanated from him and quickly found reasons to busy themselves elsewhere. Even the guards, accustomed to his presence and his authority, gave him a wider berth than usual, recognizing in the set of his jaw and the darkness of his eyes that their king was in a state best left undisturbed. As he moved, his mind worked with the clarity that only centuries of wielding absolute power could provide. He understood, on an intellectual level, that his rage could not entirely eclipse, that there were considerations beyond his immediate desire for vengeance. Aldrich Voss was a council member, a man of significant political standing within the kingdom. To execute him without trial, to burn him alive, or tear him apart with his bare hands would set a precedent that could destabilize the careful balance of power that Cale had spent years cultivating. But to destroy him politically, publicly, with the full weight of the kingdom's laws and his own authority behind the judgment, that would be so much more devastating. That would ensure that not only Aldrich, but every other potential predator in his kingdom understood that to harm someone under his protection was to invite complete and utter annihilation. His wolf keened with frustration at the delay, demanding immediate action, demanding that Cale stop thinking and start acting on his instincts. But his human consciousness held firm, exerting the dominance that made him a king rather than merely a beast. He climbed the stairs to his private chambers and found himself pacing like a caged animal, back and forth across the stone floor, his hands opening and closing, his breathing deepening. He could still smell her. The scent of Liora had embedded itself in his senses the moment his wolf recognized her, and now that scent filled his nostrils with every breath he took. It was a scent that spoke of silver and sunlight and something untamed and indefinably precious. It was a scent that made his wolf weep with the terrible need to protect her, to hold her, to make sure that nothing and no one would ever hurt her again. The worst part was understanding exactly what she had endured. His senses, sharp enough to detect a lie spoken in a whisper, had immediately parsed the truth from beneath her careful denials. There had been multiple instances of physical contact, multiple instances where she had been cornered and threatened. There had been escalation, the kind of predatory behavior that suggested Aldrich had been testing her boundaries, looking for the moment when she would break and submit to whatever he demanded of her. Cale found himself in his study, pulling documents from the shelves with violent efficiency, searching through records and reports that his administrators filed regarding council members and their activities. What he found made his rage burn even hotter. There were complaints filed years ago by servants regarding Aldrich's behavior. There were incidents noted and then dismissed, recorded as insignificant and not worth pursuing. How many other women had been hurt by this man while Cale was away governing other aspects of his kingdom, trusting his administrators to maintain order and justice in his absence. By the time the sun had set and night had fallen across Thornveil Citadel, Cale had formulated his plan. He would not attack Aldrich physically. He would not satisfy his wolf's thirst for blood and violence. Instead, he would orchestrate a reckoning so complete and so public that every council member, every noble, every servant in the kingdom would understand exactly what happened to men who preyed on those under their protection. He summoned his captains, his administrators, his most trusted advisors, and as he gave them their instructions, his voice calm and his words precise, and he felt something crystallize within him, a terrible clarity about what needed to happen next. The castle seemed to hold its breath as the day progressed. Servants whispered in the corridors, sensing that something significant was unfolding, even if they didn't understand exactly what. The guards, who usually maintain their posts with casual indifference, suddenly became hyper aware, watching the hallways with new intensity, as though they expected something momentous to occur. Runners were sent to summon council members from the various corners of the kingdom, and there was something in the urgency of these summons that suggested this was not a routine session. In the servants' quarters, Liora sat with her mending, trying to focus on the needle and thread in her hands, while her mind spiraled through various possibilities about what might happen next. She had broken a fundamental rule of survival by naming Lord Voss to the Alpha King. The shame of what had been done to her warred with the relief of having finally spoken the truth to someone with the power to do something about it. The fear that she had somehow made things worse battled against a strange new sensation that felt almost like hope. The footsteps in the corridors outside increased in frequency and urgency. Liora could hear the marching of boots, the raised voices of guards giving orders, the organized chaos that suggested the castle was being mobilized for something significant. She pressed her ear against her door, as trying to glean information from the murmured conversations of servants passing by in the halls. "The Alpha King has called an extraordinary session," one voice said, belonging to an older maidservant, whom Liora recognized. "What's it about?" another voice replied. "No one's saying anything, but I heard one of the guards mention Aldrich Voss, and he said something about exile." Leora's heart began to pound in her chest. Was Cale truly going to confront Aldrich so quickly? Was he going to remove him from the castle? The realization that Cale had taken her seriously, that he was moving with the kind of swift authority that marked a king operating at the height of his power, created a complex mixture of emotions in her chest. Relief warred with fear of what such a public confrontation might mean for her position in the castle. And the weather outside seemed to mirror the emotional turbulence of the citadel. Dark clouds had begun rolling in over the mountains that surrounded Thornveil Citadel, and the wind had picked up significantly, howling around the towers and turrets of the ancient structure. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a low and ominous sound that seemed to echo the tension building within the castle's stone walls. It was as though the very elements were responding to the presence of an Alpha King in the grip of controlled fury, as though nature itself was acknowledging the shift in power dynamics that was about to occur. Liora found herself standing at the window of the servants' quarters, looking out at the darkening sky. She wondered what Aldrich was doing right now, whether he had received the summons to council and if he understood what it meant. She wondered if he had any inkling that his careful manipulation, his slow escalation of boundary violations would come to an end so abruptly and so completely. The castle seemed to hold its breath as afternoon turned to evening. Liora could feel the shift in the air, the sensation of something vast and momentous building toward a crescendo. Whatever was about to happen, she understood with absolute certainty, would change everything. In the council chambers, an extraordinary session had been called. Most of the council members were present, though they were confused about the purpose of this hastily convened meeting. Lord Aldrich Voss was among them, sitting in his usual position with the bearing of a man who had no idea that anything was amiss. The atmosphere in the chamber was one of mild irritation and expectation, the kind that accumulated when important men were pulled away from their various tasks without proper explanation. Alpha King Kyle Thornwood entered the chamber with his personal guard, 6 massive warriors whose loyalty to their king was absolute and unquestionable. The moment he crossed the threshold, the entire tone of the gathering shifted. These were powerful men, council members who had governed alongside kings and commanded armies and negotiated the fates of nations. But none of them, not a single one, failed to recognize the danger that had just walked into their presence. Kyle took his seat at the head of the council table without any preamble or acknowledgement of courtesy. His steel-gray eyes swept across the assembled men like a searchlight, assessing each of them, noting their positions, reading their expressions. The silence that had fallen over the chamber was absolute. I have discovered a matter of grave concern to the security and integrity of this council, Kyle began, his voice carrying through the chamber with the weight of absolute authority. One of you has committed an act that is not only immoral, but punishable under the laws of this kingdom. One of you has taken it upon yourself to threaten, intimidate, and lay hands upon a member of my household staff. A ripple of discomfort ran through the council. Lord Aldrich Voss's expression had begun to shift, had started to take on the quality of someone who had suddenly realized that something was seriously wrong. This is a grave accusation, Your Majesty. The oldest council member, Lord Theron, ventured carefully. If such a thing has occurred, surely there must be evidence. Witnesses? There is evidence, Kyle replied, his gaze still fixed with laser focus on Aldrich Voss. And there is a witness, a young woman who has been entirely forthcoming about the abuse she has suffered. Aldrich had gone pale. His hand, which had been resting on the table, had begun to tremble slightly. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could form the first word, Kyle continued. Lord Aldrich Voss, do you deny that you have engaged in unwanted physical contact with a servant in my household? Do you deny that you have used your position as a council member to threaten and intimidate someone under my protection? I would never, that is, she misunderstood my intentions. Aldrich began, his voice taking on a desperate quality, the color in his face deepening to a shade that suggested either extreme embarrassment or extreme fear. So you do not deny it, Kyle said quietly. And those 4 words seemed to suck all the air out of the chamber. You admit to physically assaulting a member of my household staff. You admit to using threats and intimidation to control her behavior. The other council members were beginning to shift uncomfortably, the implications of what was happening beginning to crystallize in their minds. To assault a member of an alpha's household, to lay hands on someone under an alpha's protection, these were acts that carried severe consequences in shifter society. These were acts that could be interpreted as direct challenges to the authority and power of the alpha himself. It was nothing serious, Aldrich protested, his voice now taking on a whining quality that was particularly unpleasant. She is only a servant, after all. I was simply flirting with her, expressing my appreciation for her service. Kyle rose from his seat with a fluid grace that belied the magnitude of his rage. The council members nearest to him flinched instinctively, their bodies recognizing on a primal level that they were in the presence of a predator that could end their lives with a single motion. His massive frame unfolded in such a way that he seemed to grow even larger, to consume more space, to fill the chamber with his presence. When he spoke, His voice had dropped to barely above a whisper, but the words carried such power, such absolute conviction, that they seemed to reverberate through the stone walls of the chamber itself. "Oi, touch her again, and I'll burn this kingdom." The silence that followed was not merely the absence of sound. It was a living, breathing entity that pressed down on everyone, present with the weight of absolute certainty. No one in that chamber doubted for a single moment that the Alpha King meant exactly what he had said. This was not a metaphorical threat. This was not the posturing of an angry ruler. This was a promise made by someone who possessed both the power and the will to follow through on it. The words seemed to hang in the air long after Kale had spoken them, suspended in time like a blade held above all their heads. The alpha dominance that radiated from him was no longer merely a presence. It became a physical force, a weight that pressed down on every person in the council chamber with such intensity that several of them actually had difficulty drawing breath. It was the kind of power that bypassed the rational mind entirely and triggered the most primitive survival instincts. Lord Theron felt his hand involuntarily grip the edge of the table, his knuckles going white as he fought the overwhelming urge to submit, to bow, to acknowledge the absolute supremacy of the Alpha before him. His body was responding to an instinct far older than civilization, far older than reason. Every fiber of his being was screaming at him to lower his eyes and present his throat in the universal gesture of submission. Beside him, a younger council member, whose name was irrelevant in this moment, felt the color drain completely from his face. He had gone absolutely white, all vestiges of color leaching out of his skin as his body recognized the primal danger in the room. His heart was beating so rapidly that he thought it might burst, and he found himself making a sound that was somewhere between a whimper and a gasp as he tried to maintain control of his own physiology. Another council member, a man who had cultivated a veneer of sophisticated indifference throughout his long career, found his chair scraping backward involuntarily as his body simply moved, seeking distance from the raw apex predation that was radiating from the Alpha King. He did not consciously decide to do this. His body simply reacted, moving backward away from the source of danger, even as his conscious mind remained frozen with the knowledge that no amount of physical distance would truly protect him from this man. Lord Aldrich's body was betraying him in the most complete and humiliating way imaginable. His wolf, the primal consciousness that shared his body with his human awareness, was doing something that he had never experienced before in his life. It was attempting to submit. It was trying to bow, to cower, to present itself as non-threatening and powerless before the Alpha's dominance. He could feel his wolf trying to shift, trying to take a more submissive form, and only the absolute certainty that attempting to shift in this moment would result in his immediate execution kept him from losing control completely. His hands trembled, not from fear of judgment alone, but from the physical sensation of an Alpha's dominance pressing down on his very consciousness. It was as though Kyle was not simply making a threat, but was actually using his absolute power to assert dominance over every shifter in the room, forcing their wolves to acknowledge his superiority, forcing their bodies to respond to an authority that transcended everything except their most basic survival instincts. The pressure in the chamber was building, becoming almost unbearable. It was the kind of pressure that would eventually kill a lesser shifter, that would cause their body to simply shut down under the weight of such absolute alpha supremacy. Several of the guards standing at the perimeters of the chamber had dropped to one knee involuntarily, their wolves overriding their conscious minds and forcing them into postures of submission before their king's power. In that moment, meant suspended between Kale's terrible words and their inevitable consequences, every person in that chamber understood something fundamental about the nature of power. It was not merely about authority granted by position or title. It was about something far deeper, far more primal, far more ancient. It was about the bone-deep certainty that one being was simply more powerful, more dangerous, more absolutely dominant than all others, and they all understood, without question, without doubt, exactly what Kale meant by his promise. This was not political rhetoric. This was not the exaggeration of an angry ruler. This was the truth, spoken by someone who possessed the absolute power to make it manifest. Liora was not aware of the council's judgment until much later that evening. A member of Kale's personal staff had come to find her in the servants' quarters and instructed her to prepare herself to meet with the Alpha King in his private chambers. The journey through the castle's corridors had been one of acute anxiety, interspersed with moments of strange serenity. Her wolf knew, on some level that transcended rational thought, that she was being brought before her mate. That knowledge created a strange kind of calm beneath her fear. The Alpha King's private chambers occupied the eastern tower of Thornveil Citadel, a section of the castle that was rarely entered by servants. The space was vast and austere, decorated with the kinds of furnishings that spoke of power and history rather than comfort or ostentation. A fire roared in an enormous stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows across dark wood furniture and ancient tapestries. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, a testament to a lifetime spent accumulating knowledge and cultivating power. Kyle was standing with his back to her when she entered, silhouetted against the flames of the fire. His long black hair fell down his back in waves that seemed to capture the light of the flames. He wore clothes that emphasized the lean, corded power of his frame, tight black wool and leather that left no doubt as to the absolute physical dominance he possessed. When he turned to face her, his steel gray eyes seemed to glow with the reflection of the firelight. "Come here," he commanded, and his voice was the same one she had heard in the corridor that morning, but different now. The rawness of his emotion was less carefully controlled, the power woven through his words more undeniable. It was impossible to disobey, even if she had possessed the desire to do so. Her feet carried her across the distance between them, her heart pounding so hard that she thought it might burst through her chest. "Lord Aldrich Voss has been removed from the castle," Kyle said quietly. "He has been exiled from my kingdom. He will not be returning. He will not be bothering you ever again." Liora did not know what to say to that. She did not know how to process the reality that her tormentor had been so efficiently dispatched, so completely removed from her life. The relief that should have accompanied that knowledge seemed distant and unreal. "I want you to understand something, Liora," Kyle continued, stepping closer to her. His scent washed over her like a wave, that wild, sharp, and predatory smell that made her wolf stand on its hind legs and keen with recognition. What happened to you in those corridors was not your fault. You did not cause it, you did not deserve it, and it will never happen again. Thank you, my lord, she whispered. I don't know how to repay you for what you've done. You don't need to repay me, he said, and his hand reached out to gently touch her cheek. His fingers were warm and rough, with calluses earned through a lifetime of warfare and governing. That's not how this works. That's not how any of this works. I don't understand, she replied, though in truth, some part of her did understand. Some part of her had understood since the moment she had looked into his eyes in that corridor and felt her wolf recognize something in him that transcended her conscious mind's ability to process. My wolf knew you the moment it caught your scent this morning, Kyle said, his hand sliding down to cup her chin gently. My wolf knew that you were my mate, and I have spent the entire day coming to the same realization that my wolf already understood. But before I can claim you, before I can bring you into my life in the way that I need to understand something about you. I need to know who you are. I need to know what you're hiding, because there is something about you, Liora Ashvane, that is not like anything I've encountered before. Liora felt her heart stutter in her chest. She had feared this moment, the moment when he would demand to know the truth about her lineage, her blood, the secret that could get her killed if the wrong people discovered it. But looking into his eyes, seeing the absolute certainty in his expression, she found that the fear was beginning to fade, replaced by a strange sense of inevitability. I'm not entirely human, my lord, she whispered. My blood is part silver. It's an ancient bloodline that most people believed had died out generations ago. The silver gives me certain abilities. I can heal faster than normal humans, and I have a natural affinity for healing magic. But my presence here is dangerous. If the wrong people discovered what I am, if the wrong people thought I had something valuable to offer them. Then you came to Thornveil Citadel as a servant because it was safer than drawing attention to yourself anywhere else, Kyle finished, understanding flooding through his expression. You hid your abilities and your nature because you had learned that drawing attention was a threat to your survival. Liora nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. That time is over, Kyle said, his voice taking on a finality that made it clear he was not engaging in negotiation. You will no longer be a servant in this castle. You will no longer hide who you are. I am claiming you as my mate before this kingdom, and anyone who has a problem with that fact is welcome to take it up with me personally. He kissed her then, but it was different from the claiming she had half imagined in the secrecy of her own thoughts. It was deeper, more intimate, more real. His lips met hers with a gentleness that belied the absolute power radiating from him, and she found herself responding to him instinctively, her body recognizing something in his touch that it had been waiting for her entire life. As their lips connected, something shifted inside her chest. It was as though a door that had been sealed shut was suddenly opening, allowing something precious and long hidden to emerge into the light. Her silver blood began to resonate with his presence, responding to him in ways that were wholly physical and profoundly emotional at the same time. She could feel the mate bond settling into place between them, not imposed by force, but recognized and acknowledged by both of their wolves simultaneously. Her wolf, suppressed and bound for so many years beneath layers of fear and control, suddenly rose to full consciousness. She felt it stretching within her, testing the bonds of her human form. And rather than frightening her, the sensation was liberating. This was what her wolf had been waiting for. Not submission or domination, but a meeting of equals, a recognition of another soul that was meant to be entwined with her own. The warmth that spread through her body was unlike anything she had ever experienced. It started at the point where his lips met hers and radiated outward in waves, filling her limbs with a sensation that was almost like floating, almost like coming home after a lifetime of wandering, lost in the wilderness. Her silver blood hummed in response to his proximity, creating a tingling sensation beneath her skin that was wholly pleasant and absolutely intoxicating. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Liora found herself looking into eyes that seemed to see all of her, not just the surface, but the depths beneath, the woman she had hidden away for so long, the strength and magic and essential self that she had learned to bury beneath layers of servility and caution. "I can feel you," Kyle murmured, his forehead resting against hers. "I can feel your wolf, and I can feel your magic. You're extraordinary, Liora. Do you understand that? You're absolutely extraordinary." "I'm scared," she admitted, the words tumbling out before she could stop herself. "I've spent my entire life being invisible, being small, being powerless. And now, suddenly, you're telling me that I'm meant to be here, that I'm meant to be powerful, that I'm meant to stand beside you. I don't know if I know how to be those things." "You already are those things," Kyle said, pulling back just enough to look directly into her eyes. "You've always been those things. You just needed to be in a place where it was safe to be yourself. You needed someone who was strong enough to protect you while you grew into your own power." He led her to a chair positioned near the fire, and they sat together, his arm around her shoulders, her body nestled against his side. The warmth of his presence seemed to settle something inside her, creating a sense of peace and rightness that she had been seeking her entire life without even understanding what she was looking for. They talked through the night, and it was a conversation fundamentally different from any exchange that had occurred between them before. They were no longer king and servant, master and subordinate. They were two people connecting on a level that transcended hierarchy and status, finding in each other a mirror and a complement, a challenge and a sanctuary. Liora spoke of her childhood, of the family members who had passed down the knowledge of her silver bloodline in whispers and stolen moments. She spoke of learning to hide, of understanding from an early age that what she was constituted a threat to her survival. She spoke of the years of careful invisibility, of perfecting the art of being overlooked and forgotten. Kyle spoke of loneliness, of the burden of being an alpha king without anyone to share that burden. He spoke of the centuries he had lived with the knowledge that somewhere his mate existed, and the terrible uncertainty of not knowing if he would ever find them. He spoke of the moment he had seen her in that corridor and felt his wolf recognize something so fundamentally precious that it had brought him to his knees emotionally, even as his body had remained standing. The next morning, the Alpha King made his official announcement to the entire household. Liora stood in the great hall of Thornveil Citadel, dressed in the finest gown that had been hastily prepared for her overnight. A beautiful creation of deep emerald green that made her eyes seem to glow with an inner light. Her auburn waves had been released from their severe braid and fell in soft waves down her back. The gold flecks in her emerald eyes caught the light of 1,000 candles as she looked out at the assembled crowd of nobles, council members, servants, and guards. "I present to you Liora Ashvane, my mate," Kyle announced, his voice carrying through the great hall with the weight of absolute authority. His hand rested at the small of her back, a gesture that was both protective and possessive. "She has been discovered to possess ancient silver blood and rare healing abilities. Effective immediately, she is granted full status as a member of my household, and any who would do her harm will answer to me directly." The announcement rippled through the crowd like a stone dropped into still water. Shifter mates were rare and precious, the result of an ancient magic that bound two souls together. To have a mate publicly claimed by the Alpha King was a significant event, one that would reshape the political landscape of the kingdom in subtle but important ways. Liora caught sight of some of the council members who had been present at the previous day's extraordinary meeting. She saw the fear in their eyes, the recognition that they had very nearly made a catastrophic mistake in how they treated the woman who was now the Alpha King's mate. She saw relief in the faces of some of the servants who had always treated her with kindness despite her anonymous status. And she saw in the eyes of Kale's most trusted advisors and generals a kind of approval that suggested they had anticipated this moment and supported it fully. As the announcement concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Michael led Liora away from the great hall and toward the private quarters that would now be hers as well as his. Her former life as a servant girl, hiding in the corridors of Thornveil Citadel, felt like it belonged to someone else entirely, like it had happened to a different version of herself that no longer existed. "How are you feeling?" Kyle asked as they walked through the halls, his massive form beside her own small frame. "Overwhelmed," Liora replied honestly. "A few days ago, I was a servant. Now I'm the Alpha King's mate. The transition is difficult to process." "You'll have time to adjust," Kyle assured her. "And you'll have help. My mother is in residence in the castle at the moment, and she will want to meet you. She has strong opinions about what a mate should be, and she will likely overwhelm you with suggestions about everything, from clothing to political strategy. But she's well-intentioned, even if she can be a bit much." Liora found herself almost smiling at that. The idea that she would eventually have to meet the mother of the most powerful man in the kingdom was both terrifying and strangely comforting. It suggested a future that extended beyond the immediate present, a future that held possibility and continuity rather than just survival. "There's something else you should know," Kyle said as they reached the entrance to his private chambers. "The incident with Lord Voss is not the end of this matter. There are certain protocols that must be followed when someone of his status commits crimes against another member of the kingdom. A formal trial is being prepared, and it's likely that additional charges will be brought against him once the investigation is more thorough. It appears that you may not be the only victim he has targeted over the years. The knowledge that others might have suffered similar treatment at Aldrich's hands created a strange mixture of emotions in Liora. Sadness for those who had endured what she had endured, but also a sense of righteousness that his actions were finally being properly investigated and addressed. "Will I have to testify?" she asked. "You will," Kyle confirmed. "But you will do so as the Alpha King's mate, in the full knowledge that the kingdom's laws are now firmly on your side. You will do so with the confidence that comes from knowing that your testimony will be believed and acted upon." The trial of Lord Aldrich Voss took place 3 weeks later, in a special session of the kingdom's highest court. Liora testified with a calmness that belied her internal anxiety, detailing the incidents that had occurred over the course of several months, the unwanted physical contact, the threats, the escalating nature of his behavior. Her words were corroborated by the physical evidence of the bruises she had sustained, by testimony from other servants who had witnessed his behavior, and by documentation of his actions compiled by Kale's investigators. As it turned out, Liora was not the only victim. 3 other women came forward with similar stories: servants and merchants' daughters, and the daughter of a minor noble, all of whom had been threatened and violated by Aldrich over the years. All of them had stayed silent for the same reasons Liora had: fear of not being believed, fear of repercussions, fear of the social consequences of accusing a powerful man. The trial lasted 2 weeks and culminated in a judgment that shocked no one. Lord Aldrich Voss was found guilty of multiple counts of assault, intimidation, and abuse of authority. His exile was made permanent, and his properties were not only confiscated but redistributed to his victims and to various charitable institutions that served those who had suffered similar abuse. His name was struck from the records of the council, and any acknowledgement of his previous status was expunged from the official documentation of the kingdom. For Liora, the trial was cathartic in ways she had not anticipated. Speaking the truth about what had happened to her, hearing the court declare that she had been wronged, and receiving not just justice, but also validation. It was transformative in a way that she was still processing even weeks after the verdict had been rendered. But the greater transformation was happening in her personal life. She was learning what it meant to be the Alpha King's mate, to be someone who was valued and protected and loved, not because of what she could do for others, but simply because she existed. Kyle's devotion to her was absolute, a constant presence that surrounded her like a protective circle. When she had nightmares about what had happened, he was there to hold her through the dark hours. When she doubted herself, he was there to remind her of her own strength and resilience. She had met his mother, a formidable woman named Isabeau, who bore a striking resemblance to her son and possessed an intelligence that seemed to cut through any pretense or deception. Far from being judgmental, Isabeau had been delighted to discover that Liora possessed silver blood and healing abilities. She had immediately begun introducing her to the various magical practitioners in the kingdom who could help her develop and refine her gifts. Liora was learning to read and write at a level beyond the basic literacy that had been required of her as a servant. She was learning the complex political history of the kingdom. She was being prepared, not as a token mate to be displayed at social events, but as a true partner in the governance and protection of the realm. Kale had made it clear that he wanted her to have agency and authority, that he wanted her to be his equal in every way that mattered. One evening, several months after the trial had concluded, Liora found herself standing in the same corridor where she had first encountered Kale as the Alpha King of Thornveil Citadel. The north corridor had been redesigned slightly. The tapestries had been changed, new artwork had been installed, and the servants who worked there had been briefed on proper behavior toward all members of the household staff. These changes had been made not in response to Liora's experiences specifically, but as part of a broader reform that Kale had instituted to ensure that the castle's staff were treated with appropriate respect and dignity. Thinking about old times, Kyle's voice came from behind her, and she turned to find him approaching with that same fluid grace that had first drawn her attention to him. Thinking about how different my life is now, Liora replied. A few months ago, I was terrified of being noticed in these corridors. Now I walk through them as the Alpha King's mate, and people show me respect instead of indifference. Kyle pulled her close, wrapping his massive arms around her and drawing her back against his chest. She could feel the steady beat of his heart, the warmth of his body, the security of his presence. I want to tell you something, he said quietly, his breath warm against her ear. The moment I saw you in this corridor and my wolf recognized you, everything changed for me. I didn't know it then, but I know it now. You are the other half of my soul, Liora. You are the one I have been waiting for through all of these centuries of existence, and I will spend the rest of my life making sure that you never have to hide who you are again. I will spend the rest of my life making sure that everyone in this kingdom understands that you are valuable and worthy and absolutely irreplaceable. Liora leaned back into him, allowing herself to simply exist in this moment, secure and loved, and finally, truly safe. The bruises on her arm had long since faded, but they had left behind something far more valuable than a wound. They had left behind the catalyst that had brought her to this moment, to this understanding that sometimes when you are brave enough to speak the truth about what has been done to you, the universe conspires to ensure that you are not only heard, but protected and cherished by someone powerful enough to make sure it never happens again. The story of Liora Ashvane and Alpha King Kale Thornwood was just beginning, but as she stood in that corridor with her mate's arms around her, she knew that whatever came next, it would be faced together with the kind of bond that transcended time and fate and the fragile boundaries of mortality itself. She was no longer the invisible servant girl hiding in the shadows of Thornveil Citadel. She was the Alpha King's mate, a woman of ancient silver blood with the power to heal and the privilege of standing beside the most powerful man in the kingdom. And for the first time in her life, she was truly home.